So, seeing how the motif of finding wild, hairy, weird-looking humans in the wilderness is not so rare, it is also pretty common to have stories of people seeing or glimpsing at these sort of weird old characters. And the story here that is told by Hanno of Carthage in his journals, dated from 500 before Common Era, tell us about just such an encounter. Then, sailing along by the fiery torrents for 3 days, we came to a bay called the Horn of the South. In the recess of this bay, there was an island, like the former one, having a lake in which there was another island full of savage men. There were women too, in even greater numbers. They had hairy bodies, and the interpreters called them gorillae. When we pursued them, we were unable to take any of the men, for they all escaped by climbing the steep places and defending themselves with stones. But we took 3 of the women who bit and scratched their leaders and would not follow us. So we killed them and flayed them and brought them skins to Carthage, for we did not voyage further, provisions failing us. Now, in the context of this story, this person calling these other people men, women, but also being called gorilla by the local interpreters gives us a little bit of an uneasy feeling, of course, because if you are lucky, these were in fact gorilla. And the fact that these people hunted and killed gorillas is mildly more acceptable than them killing other men or women. But this obvious confusion here between a person and an ape should not be particularly surprising, considering that there was not a whole lot of science to differentiate the two. And in fact, for the better part of our history, we have this shared understanding of humans and the greater apes being somewhat related. And this is not a particularly new scientific discovery, of course, in the context of what we know today, because, of course, now that we have DNA and all kinds of more specific science to prove this, it is very easy to see just how much we have in common with the great apes. But the earliest attempts at classifying apes also put them in the same category as us. The primates, of course, we have remained in that same category for all these years. So this particular screenshot here from Linnaeus in 1758 places at the top of the column regarding primates, Homo, of course, the human, including Homo sapiens, of course, the humans that are the top of this food chain, if you will, proverbial food chain. So this is written in Latin, of course, so the word is actually primatus, but this is the same word that we have imported in English to refer to the same thing. And of course, we are primates because we are humans. That means we are the prime type of individuals, and the other apes, like us, are also primates because they look like us, not the other way around. At the time when Linnaeus was making this classification, he was looking at just how much we had in common with the apes and putting us in the same box based on just how good looking humans are, not just how how much we look like the apes. And certainly, as part of this classification, making sense of the things of nature, that is the title of Linnaeus's book, was a very difficult enterprise, especially once you realize that there are other places outside of Germany and Europe where Linnaeus was writing from, and that there are much more humans outside of the world that he could see. And part of his classification here in the category of humans places at the top the Homo diurnus, the human that lives in the day, and that human that lives in the day is characterized by their 4 feet, of course. But it is also characterized by a few other attributes, and if you understand Latin, it is easy to make sense out of, maybe even in English. Mutus, meaning that this person or this human is mute, and hirsutus, meaning that it is hairy. So we have at the top of the description for Linnaeus, for modern sciences, a human that is hairy and doesn't talk, as this form of wild human, if you will. And the example he gives are the young bear child from Lithuania, the young wolf child from Belensis, which would be in the modern nomenclature anyway, or in our um, in our vocabulary of today, um, would be a human from Eastern Europe. Euvenus of Venice, Hibernus would be a human, a hibernating human, if you will. Um, the Juvenus Hannoveranus from Hanover, Juvenus Pueri from Piranesi, from the Pyrenees, Johannes Leodensis from Lyon in France, or from the middle of between Switzerland and France. Ooh, this is complicated. So we have these different humans that are existing, that are identified by Linnaeus as part of the wild form of humans, that is the Homo sapiens ferus, so the wild human that is Diurnus living in a day. So there is this possibility, this understanding that there are other humans out there, including a human that would be nocturnal, living at night. And of course, there are, as part of the list, also the other humans, the ones that we are more aware of, the white people, the red people, the black people, the yellow people. This is literally the classifications that Linnaeus provides. And of course, again, we look back to our discussion of racism. More importantly for the conversation at hand, though, is that there is yet another classification that Linnaeus gives us as the Homo monstruosus, the human monstrous. And as part of the monsters, humans, he points out that there are a few different examples. For example, there's the Alpine man and the Patagonian man, so Patagonia and the Alps. So now we have mountain people, and those mountain people have their own descriptors. There's also the human monarchatus, a human that is infertile, found in Africa. There's a microcephalic human with a big head. There's a plagiocephalic human, a human with a flat skull, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole types of humans that are found here, and most of them just seem to happen mostly between the tropics, around the equator, and kind of generally far away from where Linnaeus would have found them. Now, of course, Linnaeus didn't find factually any one of them. He is relying on bones and skulls and accounts from other people that he has described, but this is his attempt to make sense out of the diversity of humanity at the very beginning of the scientific revolution. So the possibility of the monsters being a human monster, and that human monster being an existing kind of character, is not entirely out of the common, and at least that's not so long ago for us. It was a very scientific being. Of course, our science has changed quite a bit, and now we are thinking in terms of evolution. Of course, evolution, as it is described by Charles Darwin as a matter of natural selection, and shows that there is quite a possibility that these different kinds of humans might be related. Although Darwin himself did not mostly worry about humans, he was mostly worried about animals in general. It would have been very controversial for Darwin to make any such statements about how and where humans were coming about. And so he mostly stuck to the animals, for whom the controversy would have been a little bit lower. Even though today, of course, now we associate Darwin with the matters of evolution that affect humans. That was definitely something he was trying to stay away from. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way for him. Most importantly, the examples that Darwin gives, for example, the finches that are described on this particular picture slash slide here, shows how different kinds of birds that are typically understood as being from the same grouping, the same race, if you will, the same species, whatever it is, words are not defined in any kind of realistic way by science, because species and races are groups that are made by the convenience of scientists, not defined to be the universal classifier as we think of them typically. So Different finches, different types of birds that are understood to be of the same family, seem to have evolved in different ways based on the thing that they eat: leaves, seeds, fruit, insect. Each one of those requiring a certain shape of the beak, a certain kind of coloring, etc. And Darwin, of course, points out that these things are correlated and that you may very well have different kinds of finches that have different shapes of beaks because they are adapted, quote unquote, naturally to the environment they live in. And in a way, Linnaeus was doing about the same thing, that different types of humans were quote unquote adapted to their environment, but he was not seeing that as a historical process, much more that if you are born in a specific place, you are immediately affected by that place and the environment that you live in. Whereas Darwin shows that this is a process that happens over decades and centuries, in fact, and that, of course, a bird is born just a bird, but he will evolve over years and years and generations of generations into a very specific type of bird, and in this case, a very specific type of finch. Again, though, our current concern is humans, and of course, part of the discussion from Darwin goes into humans. And for example, here in this example by Ernst Haeckel, the conversation of how humans are related through some kind of evolutionary process lead us to classifying humans alongside the apes in a tree. Now, this tree format is not particularly the best way that we can picture evolution, but again, these are the very early attempts at making sense of how evolution works and especially how it affects humans. And here, representing this tree in which you have, as part of the several branches, the apes, including the chimpanzee, the gorilla, the orangutan, and the gibbon, all those things being related through the same branch is obviously a very important step in our understanding and in our classification. And certainly this is a more or less accurate representation of how we are cousins with the chimpanzees and the gorillas and the orangutans and the gibbons, the greater apes that are looking the most like us. So the fact that we have a lot in common by the looks also turns out to be a matter of a lot that we have in common in our quote unquote nature. Perhaps the most important part of this little tree here is the branch that Haeckel puts just above apes, which is ape men. These are the specific types of apes that he is talking about in this context. And the ape man is not understood to be a category in Haeckel as much as it is a human, that kind of the ancestor that we share between us and the gorillas and the chimpanzees and the orangutans and the gibbons. Now, this is very important, of course, because this ape man does not exist. But if we think of that ape man as being our ancestors, and if we think of Sasquatch as an ape man, then we could have some kind of relationship with that ape man. Maybe that ape man slash Sasquatch is our missing link. And of course, Haeckel tries to point out to this idea here of the missing link, something that we are still missing in our current science, and not specifically as of us and all of the apes, but especially who is our ancestor between us and the chimpanzee, our closest relatives, which we have a lot in common with in terms of DNA, but we, at this point in time, do not have any kind of fossil evidence of what was that thing looking like. Now, again, this is a matter of classification, so we have tons of fossils of tons of things that seem to be connected to both of them, but we don't seem to have the thing that is the most closest relative to both us and the chimpanzees. But this is probably important for us because in terms of our science here, so we are talking about the very late 19th century, early 20th century, Haeckel is pointing out that these deplorable deficiencies of empirical paleontology are balanced on the other side by a growing number of positive facts, which possess an inestimable value in human phylogeny, the classification of humans. The most interesting and the most important of these is the celebrated fossil Pithecanthropus erectus, discovered in Java in 1894 by Eugene Dubois. 3 years ago, this now famous ape-like man provoked an animated discussion at the Third International Zoological Congress in Leiden. I may therefore be allowed to say a few words as to its scientific significance. Unfortunately, the fossil remains of this creature are very scanty: a skull cap, a femur, and 2 teeth. the discovery that there is, or that there might be, such a thing as a Pithecanthropus, so a human-like ape that stands erectus, like the Homo erectus, like the human that stands upright in Java, was a very important discovery because it was for a very long time thought to be that missing link. If there is such a thing that looks a little bit more like a chimpanzee and a little bit less like a human, but a little bit more like the two of them, then we have the possibility of these kinds of humans being our ancestor. And today, of course, Pithecanthropus has been renamed as Homo erectus because this is the kind of things that it is, much more a human than an actual monkey. So the Pithecanthropus classification has disappeared, but this fossil remains as part of our understanding of a human. That being said, this kind of discovery also led to this kind of painting here by Gabriel von Max about what that fossil might have looked like. And we have a human-like monkey, a monkey-like human that is hairy, that has this kind of gait of a human, although being quite ape-like, it is also very human-like. And of course, these are the kinds of conversations that become part of the political, scientific, and perhaps a little bit more imaginary conversations about who these people are, these humans are. And in this case, of course, this is pretty close to our conversation of what Sasquatch might be, or Bigfoot, or whatever these other versions of the Yeti might have been. Now, this is especially important during this conversation because we also had very scant evidence of, well, gorillas, for example. And when before Hanno of Carthage was describing the gorillas, very few people had seen them. Hence that conversation of, is it a human or is it a gorilla? Who's to say? And hopefully he was not too horrible to these humans back then if he indeed found some gorillas. Now, the discovery of the gorilla is also something that happens around the late 19th century, early 20th century, because very few people have actually seen such a thing. And even though there are conversations, of course, in Africa of, well, hairy, tall, black-haired and strong humans kind of wandering in the forest, the conversation is, are these other humans or are they a mythical large monkey thing? And it turns out, for example, here in this conversation by Paul Duchaillu, a French traveler to Africa, that there are such things, and he in fact ends up catching one. She was seated on the ground before a cluster of pineapples, quietly eating one. She soon threw it away and plucked some of the leaves. How black the face was! She grinned now and then, probably from the joy the food gave her, and suddenly, to my utter astonishment, a little gorilla, about 2 feet and a half in height, came running to its mother, who gave a kind chuckle that resembled very much the click of the bushmen of southern Africa. Once again, weird racist commentary has, this gorilla sounds like an African person. Anyway, I began to be terribly excited. I must kill the mother and try to capture the young one. How sorry I was to be alone. I wish my men had been with me. Number one thought, we need to kill it and we need to capture it and we need to figure out exactly what this thing is. In fact, in terms of whether it is more like a human, more like a monkey or an ape or whatever. You'd be glad to know that as part of this conversation, he actually eats the gorillas. So that is also part of this conversation, perhaps. So finding that they are apes, large apes, especially much larger apes than us, and how those things are related to us is obviously a very recent development in our science, and it is a very easy explanation as to who these things might be. And of course, part of the conversation of Sasquatch is whether it is a missing ape type of thing, whether it is an ape, great ape type thing. There are some conversations about being a different type of monkey ape, or what is called Gigantopithecus. This picture here from the Duchaillu book shows how a human might have found traces of a gorilla, of the feet of a gorilla, and comparing the big feet of the gorilla with their own. So, this entire conversation here has a lot to do with who we are as people and who we are on this evolutionary tree, of course, in terms of who we are as humans and who our closest neighbors might be.